I spent 6 months overseas believing my girlfriend was counting down the days until I came home. She promised she would be waiting for me at the airport. She was there but not for me. Standing beside a richer, more successful man, she looked at him the way she used to look at me before walking away without a second thought. That moment shattered my heart and changed my life forever. What she never expected was that losing her would become the best thing that ever happened to me. I checked my phone for the 10th time as I walked through the airport terminal. "Welcome home, Jason," I whispered to myself with a smile. 6 months. That was how long I had been overseas for work. 6 months of video calls, late-night messages, and promises. Especially Emily's promises. "I'll be the first person you see when you get back," she had told me before I left. "I can't wait," I had replied. "Neither can I. I'll be standing right there waiting for you." I remembered every word. As I entered the arrivals hall, my heart started racing. Then I saw her. Emily. My smile froze. She was standing near the exit. But she wasn't alone. A tall man stood beside her. At first I wasn't worried. Maybe he was a coworker. Maybe a friend. Maybe someone giving her a ride. Then she laughed. The sound was familiar. The smile was familiar. The way she looked at him was familiar too. Because that used to be the way she looked at me. I stopped walking. "No," I muttered. The man leaned closer and said something. Emily smiled again. My stomach twisted. I forced myself to move forward. "Emily." She turned. For a second our eyes met. I expected excitement, relief, happiness. Instead she looked uncomfortable. "Jason," she said quietly. I reached them. "Hey." The words felt strange. Emily glanced at the man beside her. "This is Ryan." Ryan extended his hand. "Nice to meet you." I stared at it before shaking it. "Yeah." An awkward silence followed. I looked at Emily. "What's going on?" She sighed. "Jason, we need to talk." My chest tightened. "Then talk." She looked away. "Things changed while you were gone." "What does that mean?" "Please don't make this harder." I laughed nervously. "Harder than what?" Ryan shifted beside her. Emily took a deep breath. "I've moved on." For a moment I thought I heard her wrong. "You what?" "I've moved on." The airport noise seemed to disappear. I could only hear my heartbeat. "Emily, stop joking." "I'm not joking." I stared at her. "What about us?" She folded her arms. "There isn't an us anymore." I felt like someone had punched me. 6 months. My voice shook. 6 months and that's it? It wasn't sudden. "What are you talking about?" "We were already having problems. We talked every day." "I know. You told me you loved me." "I did." I blinked. "Did." Emily closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry." Ryan stepped closer. "Maybe we should go." That was when he placed his arm around her waist. Everything became clear. Every excuse. Every strange message. Every missed call. Every delayed reply. I looked at Emily. "How long?" She didn't answer. "How long?" "A few months." The words cut deeper than a knife. I nodded slowly. "Wow. Jason." "No." I stepped back. "Don't." She looked guilty for the first time. "I never wanted to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "That's funny." "Please understand." "I understand perfectly." Nobody spoke. Finally Ryan said, "Come on, Emily." She hesitated. Then she followed him. Just like that. No hug. No goodbye. No question about my trip. Nothing. I watched them disappear into the crowd. Then I stood there alone. Hours later, sitting in the back of a taxi, I stared out the window. Every memory replayed in my head. Every promise. Every dream. Every plan. I kept asking myself the same question. What did I miss? Then another question followed. When did I stop being enough? I stopped answering calls after the airport day and stayed in my room for weeks telling myself I was fine. Sarah kept knocking on my door saying, "Jason, open up, please talk to me," but I said nothing. One night she forced her way in and said, "You can't do this alone." I said, "I am fine, Sarah," but she shook her head. "You are not." "Tell me what happened," she said softly. I looked away and said, "Nothing happened, I just need time." She sat beside me and said, "Jason, I heard about Ryan." That name made my chest tighten. "David told me," she said. "He said Emily was seeing someone else before you came back." I felt sick, but I said, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Sarah said, "We didn't know how to tell you." I stood up and said, "I need answers." That night I went to Emily's apartment and knocked hard. She opened the door and said, "Jason, what do you want?" I said, "Tell me the truth about Ryan." She looked away and said, I was tired of waiting, Jason. I said, so you chose him over me? She said, he gives me a future. I laughed and said, so I wasn't enough. She stayed silent. I turned and walked away and said, don't call me again. Outside I breathed heavily and thought, everything I believed was a lie. David met me the next day at a cafe and said, I should have told you earlier. I said, you knew. He said, I didn't know how serious it was. I looked at him and said, everyone knew except me. Sarah hugged me later and said, you're stronger than this. I said, no more answers. That night I thought long and hard and said, I am done chasing ghosts. I stopped checking my phone every minute and told myself, move forward. I started working out and focusing on my job. Sarah said, that's better. I replied, I am not going back. David texted, you deserve better. I said, I am not the same anymore. Sarah said, I can see that. I looked out the window and said, I lost someone I loved but I found myself. Sarah said, that's the truth. I nodded and said, no more pain like this. I walked outside and said, today I start again. Sarah followed and said, I will stay with you. I sat in a small cafe later and said, no more looking back. The world felt quieter and I said, this is my life now. I thought about Emily once more and said, I forgive you but I don't need you. Sarah sat across from me and said, are you okay now? I smiled slightly and said, I will be okay because I chose myself this time. She nodded and said, I'm proud of you. I looked at the door and said, that chapter is closed forever. I finally felt free for the first time in months. And I chose to live again now. I stopped waiting for closure and started working like my life depended on it. One morning my manager Mark said, Jason, come to my office. I walked in and he said, we're promoting you. I blinked and said, me? He nodded, you're leading the Orion project. I said, that's a huge responsibility. Mark smiled, you can handle it. I left his office and whispered to myself, this is my chance. Days turned into weeks and work became my escape. Then Mark introduced me to her. This is Olivia Reed, she will be your project consultant. I shook her hand and said, nice to meet you. She smiled and said, I've heard good things about you. I replied, I hope they are true. She laughed softly and said, we will see. During meetings she never judged me. One day I said, most people expect too much pressure in meetings like this. Olivia said, I don't judge people by pressure, I judge by honesty. I looked at her and said, that's rare. She replied, so are people who actually listen. For the first time in months I felt normal talking to someone. Later Sarah called me and said, you sound different. I said, I am working more. She said, that's not what I mean. I sighed and said, I stopped thinking about Emily all the time. Sarah said, good, you needed that. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Days later I told her, I think I am getting better. She said, I know, I can hear it in your voice. At night I still had moments where I thought about Emily. I would sit alone and say, did she ever miss me? But those moments became less painful. One evening Olivia said, you push yourself too hard. I said, I don't know how to stop anymore. She looked at me and said, maybe you don't need to stop, maybe you just need balance. I replied, sounds easy when you say it. She smiled, it is not easy for anyone. For the first time I laughed without forcing it. Months passed and I started running every morning. I said to myself, I am not who I was before. Sarah saw me one day and said, you look healthier. I said, I feel lighter. She hugged me and said, I am proud of you. I replied, I am still learning. One afternoon I passed a cafe where Emily and I used to sit. I stopped and thought, I am not that person anymore. Then I walked away without looking back. Later Olivia said, you seem more at peace. I said, I am trying. She nodded and said, it shows. But deep inside I still had one question. I wondered if Emily ever thought about me. Then one day everything changed. I saw her again at a corporate event. She stood across the room. And she was not smiling anymore. Months passed and I told myself I was done looking back. Then Mark said, Jason, you need to attend the Orion networking event tonight. I replied, do I have to? He said, yes, it's important for the project visibility. So I went. Inside the hall I adjusted my tie and said quietly, just another event. Olivia walked beside me and said, you look like you want to escape. I said, I kind of do. She smiled, then stay anyway. I nodded and said, fine. Then I saw them. I froze and said under my breath, no way. Olivia asked, what is it? I said, Emily and Ryan. She looked and said, you know them? I replied, yeah. I know them. From across the room they looked perfect. Ryan laughed loudly and said something to a group. Emily stood beside him smiling like nothing ever happened. I whispered, they look happy. Olivia said, people usually do in rooms like this. But something felt off. Later I walked toward the drinks table and overheard voices. Ryan's voice snapped, Emily, stop correcting me in front of people. Emily said quietly, I was just trying to help. Ryan replied, just stay quiet. I frowned and said softly, that doesn't sound good. Emily looked embarrassed and nodded. I stepped back before they noticed me. Olivia joined me and said, you okay? I said, they don't look like they used to. She replied, people change under pressure. I nodded but didn't answer. Later Emily approached me alone. She said softly, Jason, hi. I replied, hi. She asked, how have you been? I said, busy. Silence followed. She said, you look different. I answered, so do you? She looked down and said, I didn't expect to see you here. I said, same. She hesitated and said, are you still angry? I shook my head, no, I am not angry anymore. That surprised her. She said, really? I replied, I moved on, Emily. Her eyes lowered and she said, I guess that's good. Then Ryan called her name sharply from across the room. She flinched and said, I should go. I nodded, take care. She walked away slowly and I stayed still. Olivia came back and said, that was her. I said, yeah. She asked, you okay? I said, strangely, yes. Olivia said, good, that means you healed. Later I met a woman named Rachel at the bar. She said, you work with Orion, right? I said, yes. She said, then you should know Ryan Mitchell is in trouble. I frowned, what kind of trouble? She leaned closer and said, investors are pulling out of his company. I asked why. She said, bad management and internal conflicts. I stayed silent. Then she added, Victor Hayes is trying to save it but it's falling apart. I repeated quietly, Victor Hayes. She nodded, his partner. I looked across the room at Ryan and said nothing. For the first time I didn't feel pain. I felt distance. Olivia returned and said, you look like you just saw a ghost. I said, maybe I saw the past catching up. She asked, and how do you feel? I said, calm. Because for the first time I realized. Karma was already moving without me. I heard about Ryan's downfall before I ever saw it with my own eyes. Mark said, Jason, have you seen the news? I asked, what news? He said, Mitchell's company is collapsing. I paused and said, Ryan. He nodded, investors are pulling out everywhere. I leaned back and said, so it's true. Olivia looked at me and said, you don't seem surprised. I replied, I am not. She asked why. I said, some things were always going to break. That evening Sarah called and said, did you hear about Emily? I said, no. She said, she went back to Ryan. I frowned, what do you mean back? Sarah said, they are living together now but it sounds bad. I stayed silent and said, I see. Days passed and I tried to focus on work. Then one night my doorbell rang. I opened it and froze. Emily. She looked tired and said, Jason, I need to talk. I said, why are you here? She stepped inside and said, please just listen. I closed the door slowly and said, talk. She looked down and said, Ryan is not who I thought he was. I replied, I noticed that already. She said, he changed after I moved in. I said, people usually don't change that fast. She shook her head, he is controlling, Jason, he yells at me, he ignores everything I say. I stayed quiet. She continued, the future I believed in never existed. I said softly, so you finally see it? She looked at me and said, I made a mistake. Those words stopped everything inside me. For a moment I didn't speak. Then I said, you made a mistake. She nodded with tears in her eyes, yes. I walked a few steps away and said, funny, I used to wait for you to say that. She said, I know. Silence filled the room. She asked, can we start over? I turned back and said, start over. She said, yes, Jason, I still care about you. I looked at her carefully. And I remembered the airport. I remembered standing alone while she walked away without looking back. I remembered nights I couldn't sleep. I said, do you know what I went through? She whispered, I do. I shook my head, no you don't. She said, I am sorry. I replied, sorry doesn't change what happened. She stepped closer, I can fix this. I raised my hand and said, stop. She froze. I said, I am not the same person anymore. She said, I can see that. I took a breath and said, I built myself back from nothing, Emily. She said, I want to be part of your life again. I looked at her and said, why? She said, because I miss us. I laughed once and said, you miss what was convenient. She lowered her head. I said, not what was real. Long silence. Then I said, I forgive you. She looked up quickly, so we can? I cut her off, but I don't want you back. Her face changed completely. I continued, I think about the airport every time I look at you. She whispered, Jason, please. I said, no, Emily, that version of me is gone. She stepped back slowly. I opened the door and said, you should leave. She stood there crying but didn't move. I said again, goodbye. Finally she walked out. I closed the door and stood still. My chest felt heavy but clear. Olivia texted me later, you okay? I replied, yes, I chose peace. And for the first time I meant it completely. Emily didn't stop after that night. She texted me the next day saying, Jason, please, I just want to talk. I stared at my phone and said quietly, not again. Then another message came. I know I hurt you, but I've changed. I muttered, everyone says that when it's too late. Sarah called me later and said she contacted me too. I asked what did she want. Sarah said she wants you back. I sighed and said of course she does. Sarah stayed quiet, then said, I am not going to decide this for you. I said, I know. She added, but don't let her pull you back into pain. I replied, I won't. At work Olivia noticed I was distracted and said, she again. I nodded, she keeps trying. Olivia said, do you want her to stop? I said, I don't know anymore. She looked at me and said, healing isn't about answering her questions. I asked, then what is it about? She said, it's about answering your own life. That stayed in my mind all day. Later Emily called again and said, Jason, please, just one meeting. I stayed silent. She said, I need closure. I laughed softly and said, closure. She whispered, please. I finally said, one meeting. Sarah said, are you sure? I said, I need to end this properly. Olivia said, then do it for yourself, not for her. I nodded, I will. The next evening I met Emily at a quiet cafe. She was already there waiting. She stood up and said, thank you for coming. I sat and said, say what you need to say. Her hands were shaking. She said, I am sorry, Jason, for everything. I replied, I know. She looked shocked, that's it? I said, I've heard it before. She said, but I mean it now. I looked at her and said, I believe you. Tears filled her eyes. Then can we try again? I shook my head slowly, no. She froze, no. I said, Emily, I forgive you, but I am not coming back. She said, I changed. I replied, so did I. Silence fell between us. She whispered, I lost you, didn't I? I said, you lost the version of me that waited. She covered her face and cried. I stood up and said, thank you for saying sorry. She looked up, that's it? I said, that's it. I turned toward the door and she said, Jason, please don't leave like this. I stopped and said, I am not leaving you. I looked at her one last time and said, I am choosing me. Then I walked out. Behind me I heard her crying, but I didn't turn back. Outside the air felt lighter. I breathed deeply and said, it's over. My phone buzzed. Sarah texted, how did it go? I replied, I chose myself. Then Olivia sent a message saying, proud of you. I smiled and said softly, for the first time I am free. And I meant every word. A year changed everything. One morning Olivia looked at me and said, you know you're smiling more these days. I laughed and replied, maybe life finally stopped trying to kill me. She shook her head and said, no, you finally stopped letting the past control you. I reached for her hand and said, maybe you're right. Work was better than it had ever been. The Orion project became a huge success. Mark walked into my office one afternoon and said, congratulations, partner. I laughed and asked, partner? He nodded and said, you've earned it. I stood there speechless. A year ago I had been sitting alone in my apartment wondering what was wrong with me. Now my career was thriving. My confidence had returned. And most importantly, my life finally felt like mine. Later that week Sarah called me. She said, remember when you wouldn't leave your room? I groaned and said, do we really need to remember that? She laughed. I do, because look at you now. I smiled and replied, thanks for not giving up on me. Never, she said. A few days later I stopped at a small bookstore after work. As I walked toward the exit I heard a familiar voice. Jason. I turned around. It was Emily. For a moment neither of us spoke. She looked different. Quieter. Older somehow. Not because of age. Because life had humbled her. Hi Emily, I said. She smiled softly. How have you been? Good, I answered. Really good. She nodded. I can see that. An awkward silence followed. Then she said, I heard about your promotion. I laughed lightly. News travels fast. It does. She looked down before saying, congratulations. Thank you. She took a slow breath. I'm happy for you. I could tell she meant it. That surprised me. Then she asked, "Are you still with Olivia?" I smiled immediately. "Yeah." Emily noticed. "I guess that's my answer." I chuckled. "She's amazing." "I'm glad." There was no bitterness in her voice. Only honesty. After a few seconds she said, "I think about what happened sometimes." I stayed quiet. She continued, "I handled everything badly." I nodded. "You did." She gave a small sad smile. "I know." Then she looked at me and said, "Losing you was one of the biggest mistakes of my life." A year ago those words would have meant everything. Now they simply felt like the truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. I replied quietly. "We both learned something from it." She nodded. "I suppose we did." For the first time there was no anger between us. No resentment. No pain. Only acceptance. She glanced toward the door. "I should go. Take care, Emily." "You too, Jason." Then she walked away. I watched her leave. Not with sadness. Not with satisfaction. Just peace. As I stepped outside I realized something important. The greatest victory was never making Emily regret losing me. The greatest victory was becoming someone who no longer needed her validation. I drove home smiling. When I opened the front door, Olivia called from the kitchen. "How was your day?" I walked over and kissed her forehead. "Pretty perfect." She laughed. "That's a good answer." That evening we sat together watching the sunset. I looked at the sky and thought about the airport, the heartbreak, the loneliness, the months of rebuilding. Back then I believed my life was falling apart. Now I understood the truth. The worst day of my life had quietly become the beginning of my best one. And for that I was grateful.